After every major battle, 50,000 Roman soldiers stopped fighting, lowered their weapons, and did something that should have been impossible. They survived devastating wounds safely in the middle of enemy territory. No modern hospitals, no antibiotics, no sterile surgical suites, just open ground, bronze tools, and the dirt of a foreign battlefield. And yet the Roman army recovered so predictably that within weeks they were healed, fed, and ready to march another 30 kilometers. How? The answer is a medical system so sophisticated that modern combat medics still study it. A system that turned an empty, blood-soaked field into a functioning trauma center in under 4 hours. Every single campaign, for months on end. The Roman soldiers' relationship with survival began not when the battle ended, but in the heat of combat. While the army was still fighting, a team of specialized medics, the capsari, moved directly behind the front lines to select and triage the bleeding men. By the time the infantry lines rotated back, the medical evacuation routes had already been established with absolute precision. Every wounded soldier knew exactly where to go. There was no confusion, no argument, no searching for a healer. The system eliminated the chaos that plagued other ancient armies at the end of a bloody slaughter. The Roman field hospital, or valetudinarium, followed an identical rectangular plan inside the camp every single time. The Principia, the command tent, always occupied the center. The surgical tents always sat in a designated quiet zone, isolated from the cavalry and main roads. The triage area always ran directly from the main gates. Every medic station was fixed relative to these axes. Why does this matter for survival? Because a soldier who arrives exhausted, bleeding from a severed artery after hours of hand-to-hand combat, does not want to think. He needs to find his stretcher, drop his armor, and get a tourniquet. The standardized layout meant his comrades could carry him to his assigned surgeon in the chaos of war without confusion. Celsus, writing in the 1st century AD, describes the medical sequence precisely. First, the perimeter ditch of the camp was dug, a trench roughly 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, securing the entire hospital from sudden raids. The excavated earth formed a rampart on the inside. On top of the rampart went sharpened stakes, the pila muralia, which protected the vulnerable recovering men. The entire safe zone could be completed by a trained legion in under 3 hours. Inside the perimeter, the hospital tents went up in their designated rows. Aisles were left wide and completely clear between patient beds for the rapid movement of surgeons. Latrines were positioned strictly at the downwind corner, isolating infectious waste from open wounds. Fires for boiling water and instruments were lit in designated sterile areas. The field that an hour earlier was an empty pasture was now a functioning fortified hospital. The Roman medical kit, the capsa, was a masterpiece of functional design. It was packed with tightly woven linen bandages, hemostatic herbs, and bone saws. The bandages were soaked in vinegar and wine to resist bacterial infection. The surgical tools were heavy, cast from pure bronze and iron, approximately several kilograms of metal, but they were also nearly indestructible in field conditions. Cheap iron rusts in prolonged wet weather. Polished bronze, properly maintained, survives seasons of hard use and constant boiling. The Romans chose these materials deliberately, and the choice reflected a military culture that prioritized long-term patient survival over short-term convenience. Each medical squad operated as a unit of highly trained specialists. These men were the atomic unit of the Roman medical corps. They trained together, marched together, triaged together, and operated together. The medical squad sharing an operating table was not just a logistical arrangement. It was the foundation of combat cohesion. A soldier did not fight for Rome in the abstract. He fought because he knew the men behind him would not let him bleed out in the dirt. Inside the hospital tent, space was organized with military precision. Dirty armor and weapons were stripped at the entrance. Shields, spears, and heavy kit were never taken inside the operating area. This served two purposes. First, it kept the surgical space completely clear of battlefield mud and rust. Second, it meant the medics could access the wounded flesh immediately. The interior was divided into strict sections, a front area for triage and bleeding control, and a rear recovery area where the injured men lay on clean, straw-filled mattresses off the cold ground. Hygiene was managed collectively. Hundreds of men in a confined space generate significant risk of disease. Roman medics boiling their tools in water and washing wounds with acidic vinegar could maintain survivable infection rates, even in filthy European winters. Archaeological evidence from military hospitals in Britain shows Roman surgeons utilizing specific instruments to extract barbed arrows without tearing surrounding tissue. They were in agony, but they were surviving. The Roman army did not simply bandage a wound and hope for the best. Surgery itself was organized as a military operation with the same precision applied to every other aspect of campaign life. The recovery period was divided into strict observational shifts, the excubii. Every medic served long rotations, which meant continuous hours of monitoring fevers, changing dressings, and administering painkillers like henbane. The shifts rotated through the medical units so that no single healer bore a disproportionate burden. Sanitation was enforced with a system that had no tolerance for failure. The camp prefect inspected the hospital wards daily. If a ward was found filthy, or if a medic failed to boil his surgical tools, the investigation began immediately. Allowing an infection to spread due to negligence in the Roman army was not a disciplinary infraction. It was treated as a severe crime. Historical texts record the brutal logic of Roman discipline applied to camp hygiene. The soldier responsible could be severely beaten by his fellow legionaries. The entire unit participated. The logic was brutal but coherent. A negligent medic or a soldier ignoring latrine rules endangered every life in the camp with disease. The punishment was collective because the risk of dysentery or camp fever was collective. This was not merely a threat. Roman military medical records confirm that strict hygiene protocols were carried out. The fear of disease and punishment was real, and the sanitary system therefore functioned. Wounds were cleaned. The hospital operated securely because the men boiling the water understood the stakes perfectly. Not everyone in the Roman medical system performed basic first aid on the muddy ground. The legion's senior medical officers, the medicus primus, operated out of the valetudinarium's central surgical bays. This was a dedicated, highly organized structure with separate compartments for different types of injuries. His specialized surgeons had their own areas. Surgical tools, herbal remedies, and bandages were stored here under heavy guard. The hospital was also the one location in the camp that was never fully dark. Lamps burned through the night over the operating tables, and orderlies constantly monitored the critical patients. centurions, the backbone of the Roman military, occupied a crucial role in this process. Each century's centurion knew the exact physical condition of his troops. He walked the hospital lines to check on his wounded veterans immediately. The centurion's proximity to his recovering soldiers was not accidental. He was responsible for returning them to the fighting line. If his century suffered preventable losses due to poor camp hygiene, the centurion answered for it personally. The centurion also had the authority to enforce recovery. If a soldier was found neglecting his wounds or refusing his bitter herbal medicines, the centurion acted. His vine stick, the vites, the badge of his rank, was not only a symbol, it was a tool he used freely on soldiers who required harsh correction to stay alive. The contrast with contemporary armies makes the Roman system's sophistication unmistakable. Medieval European armies on campaign typically treated their wounded in whatever haphazard arrangement circumstances allowed. There was no standard medical layout, no systematic evacuation of the injured, no organized corps of combat medics. Knights and nobles had personal physicians with leeches and prayers. Common soldiers bled out on the ground, in the open, wrapping their own wounds in dirty rags if they had them. The treatment of infection, if it existed at all, was handled haphazardly. The consequences were predictable. Medieval armies were regularly decimated by camp diseases. Minor abdominal wounds were a standard death sentence, precisely because medieval forces were utterly vulnerable to sepsis. Dying slowly from a rusted blade was not unusual, it was expected. Roman soldiers were almost never abandoned to gangrene. The combination of the rapid field evacuation, the organized surgical triage, the standardized use of antiseptics like vinegar, and the collective punishment for poor hygiene created a medical shield that was genuinely difficult for disease to breach without warning. Even a small Roman force in a properly constructed hospital camp could save hundreds of critically wounded men from an agonizing death. Julius Caesar describes the Roman medical and logistical system in his Gallic Wars with evident pride. He notes that his men could recover from battle and rebuild their fighting strength faster than the Gauls could organize a response. The medical corps was not just a charity. It was a tactical asset, a mobile life support machine that the army carried with it and deployed from scratch after every single battle, regardless of terrain, weather, or the proximity of the enemy. Roman field hospitals did not simply pack up when they felt like it. The medical tents moved to a trumpet signal, the classicum. The sequence was fixed. First signal, prepare the wounded for transport. Second signal, strike the surgical tents and pack the bronze equipment. Third signal, load the stretcher bound into the wagons. From first trumpet to marching column, a practiced Roman medical unit could have hundreds of patients moving in under 2 hours. Before the march began, the hospital was systematically dismantled. Surgical tents were rolled and loaded onto the pack mules that traveled with each medical cohort. The infectious waste trenches were filled in. The sterilization fires were doused. The heavy wooden operating tables were dismantled and loaded back onto the wagons to be used again that night. The perimeter ditch was not filled in. That was too time-consuming, but every piece of medical gear was removed. The hospital that had been a trauma center the night before was reduced to an empty field with a rectangular ditch within 2 hours of the morning trumpet. The Roman army's approach to medicine was not comfort. it was control. Every aspect of the recovery, the hospital layout, the triage assignment, the surgical rotation, the rigorous sterilization was designed to extract maximum survivability from a force that needed to heal, fight, and march again the next month, and the month after that for years at a time. The soldier who bled in a Roman field hospital bled behind a fortified perimeter, watched over by medics whose lives depended on keeping him alive, in a position where he could be stitched up and bandaged in minutes if his arteries ruptured. Consider what this meant in practice. An army that heals securely is an army that wakes up strong. An army that survives its wounds marches further, fights harder, and fights with absolute fearlessness under pressure. The Roman medical system was not a luxury add-on to military operations. It was a force multiplier. Every life saved inside those leather walls was an investment in the next battle's fighting capacity. That is not charity. That is military engineering applied to the problem of human mortality in the dirt, and the evidence is in the results. The Roman army campaigned across 3 continents, in climates from the Scottish Highlands to the Mesopotamian desert. For centuries, its soldiers marched, its soldiers fought, and when its soldiers fell, they survived. What do you think was the hardest part of being wounded in a Roman legion? The surgery without anesthesia, the bitter herbal medicines, or the agonizing wagon ride? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more from the Roman Army Daily Life series, subscribe. The next video goes inside the Roman military kitchen,